Ms. Moore?
Here.
Mr. Wright?
Here.
Mr. Gillis is stuck on the freeway, he's absent. Mr. Sheridan?
Here.
Ms. Hughes?
Here.
Mr. Pollack is not here. Mr. Lopez?
Here.
Okay. We'll open it up for public. Oh, I'm sorry. First, we have approval of minutes.
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Mr. Lopez, thank you.
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Hughes. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next, we'll open it for public comment. Seeing no one here, we'll close public comment. We have no public meeting items. We have no public hearing items, no discussion items. So our future meeting dates are Tuesday, June 11th, June 25th, and July 9th. Do we know if we have items for those meetings?
We do for July, or June 11th, June 25th. As of now, we have nothing. And what's the next one?
July 9th?
July 9th, we have an item. For that.
Okay, great. Seeing no other business for our regular meeting, we'll stand adjourned. And now we will open our meeting as a work session. And who am I turning it over to? Teresa?
Is it on? Yeah. So as part of the Land Development Code rewrite, we had planned this series of work sessions. Last time we had one on form-based code, and tonight we're going to discuss architectural guidelines. And tonight I'm going to share the presentation with Genoveva Fruit. You all know her. She's also an architect. She has been involved in actually in the elaboration of the guidelines that we have in our Land Development Code now, and she's the one that has been applying it since 2006. And also I wanted her to participate because Ms. Fruit was an associate professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where I graduated. She was a professor there. So I thought it was good to have her also, as a professor here, discussing architecture with us. This is really sensitive. The agenda tonight, we're going to then split. The first part, Ms. Fruit is going to present, and she'll discuss, the principles of good architecture, architecture in context, what are the elements that we take into account when we discuss and review architecture in our review process, and how the city has been reviewing it. And I will be discussing, then have a broader focus on how we can interfere in the public space, also taking into account the streetscape and the open space, the public space, and checking the opportunities for large and small interventions, and then we'll discuss some other programs too. So I'll pass to, and then we will open for discussion. I'll pass to Geno.
Good evening, Madam Chairperson and PZA members. We will start, what I'm going to do is I will go over the structure of how we look at the architectural guidelines today, how we analyze projects, and we will make some discussions and show you what could be changed or not, and what we would like to discuss and have some input from you. But before that, I'd like to discuss very briefly what are the main principles of architecture and what do we look when we look at a building. So what you see on the screen is what we call the three main principles of architecture. These were extracted from a publication from 27 BC, which the author was a Roman architect called Vitruvius. and it's from a publication that's actually, the name is On Architecture, and it has 10 volumes. These 10 volumes, they deal not only with the building, but also with the siting of architecture, with the materials, with the proposition of infrastructure. At that time, water, aqueducts, with interior spaces too, in the sense that how they used stucco, how they used frescoes. So it's really a reference for all architects, and it has been used since then. So the main three principles of architecture, according to Vitruvius, and still used today, are mainly three: durability, which is in Latin is firmatis, utility, utilitas, and beauty, venustatis. So these are the three things that we have to look at a building when we are analyzing, and we consider that to be architecture. So it's important that it stands correctly, that it will stand the passing of time, that the function also is according to what it is needed, and that it's beautiful. So these are the main things that we would look at a building. When we look at architecture on a from a public institution point of view, we are not going to look at it the same way that a professor would look at it, or when you have an architectural contest. We cannot look at everything. What we are going to discuss from now on is what we think that should be the role of the public sector, us, in looking at establishing architectural guidelines, and what is the importance of doing that. So what we could control more is how the building interacts with the public space. So that's the main issue. When we look at the context, because architecture is not, the buildings are not set on space. I mean, they are on a site, they are on a city, they are in the countryside. There is always a context that you have to take into account. We look usually mainly at four things: how they relate to the street, how they relate to the open space, how they relate to other buildings, and how they relate to the transportation in terms of how do you get there, how you can access that building. So these are the four main issues that we think that it's the role of the public sector in looking at a building. What you see here is an example of how the buildings interact with how they conform the open space. This is what is called the Royal Crescent. It's in Bath, in England. It was done by a architect, John Woods. And what is interesting about that is that, this is an example of what they call a Georgian style. And you can see that it's in the form of a crescent, especially in the second slide, you can see that the front is it conforms the shape of the building, it conforms the open space, that green. On the other side, the shape of the facades of the public space, they are very formal, they are very, they look alike. They have repetition, they have noble materials. On the back, you can see that these are actually 30 houses originally. They have different shapes, different roofs, and what was interesting is that when it was done, this was done thinking about the public space, because the architect, he designed the facade, and the prospective buyers, they would hire another architect to do the interior of the house, the roofs, and whatever they wanted. So it's, you can see the two aspects of architecture in this example, in the sense that you have the interaction with the public space and the intention to be something that would impact the urban space. In this case, it's an open space, and I'd say, private side of the architecture. So that would That was then one example of how it interacts with the open space. In this slide, you can see how it interacts with other buildings. This is just an example of one infill housing, which you can see in the middle is the type of new building that follows the same lines, basic lines of symmetry and also of the materials that are used, but they are using some, you can see on the cross-section that they are using different types of more modern materials. The facade is recessed from the main line of the street line, and at the same time, it fills in. I mean, it's modern, but it relates well with this, in this case, with this context. On the bottom, what you're seeing is Celebration. Maybe many of you have been there. The right slide, and this is one example of how it relates to transportation. I use that because on this slide here, you can see the circles in red is where the parking lots are, and you see that the blue one, it shows you that the buildings are going around the parking lot. So what you have on the street is actually just facades with, in this case, retail buildings and commercial buildings without any type of parking in front of it. You can park on the other side. So that's another way on how the architecture of the building, it relates to the street. This is just another example of the street itself, on how the buildings, the heights, the volumes, they conform the shape of the street. The street is actually a big room. The buildings, the facade of the buildings are the walls. And on the other two slides, you just have an idea of the height. In this one here, you have a 3-story high building, and on the back, recessed, you have higher buildings, so it gives you a better scale in terms of the human scale. And you can see on the bottom how it doesn't give you an impression of enclosure. So when we look at why do we apply architectural guidelines in our in a city like Oviedo or any other city, so it's important that the function is meaningful and it's visually pleasant for the urban space. It can complement or it can contrast the urban space too. So not necessarily it has to be equal, but sometimes the difference makes what it takes for a good building to. If it's going to be well built in the sense that it has to comply with all the architectural and building codes, if the materials are also well in place, it will age well, it will have a good maintenance, and what type of feeling that you have when you look at that building. I mean, is it a surprise? Is it does it inspire? Does it shock? So all these type of things that we can take into account when we look at a building. These are I just put this slide here just to show you what are the elements of the building of design. You have in a building, you have foundations, the structure, you have the floors and ceiling, you have the external walls, doors and windows, roof, the building services. And when you look at how you do that, how you design, you have also many other elements, which are the technique and material that you choose, the function, and the volume and the space, and also the proportion and the geometry. So everything together is what it makes a good architecture. Well, when we look at a building from the standpoint of a public sector, we don't look at everything. We don't look at the foundations, we don't look at the structure in terms of architectural guidelines. I'm not talking about the code, the building code issues. We look at some things that are the ones that are important for the public space. We look at what would be what I'd call the envelope of the building, which are the exterior walls, the doors and windows, how it relates to the exterior, the roof, and the building services. When we look about on how it is designed, we look mostly at the volume and at the space, because that's what it will conform the urban space. That's what we see from the outside. That's how it will impact the urban space. So many times we are tempted to look at everything, but it's not our role as a public institution, because we have to check how it will impact our street, how it will impact the sites, the open space, and the transportation. So here is just a list of all what we have today for our architectural standards. We look at, the goal is to enhance the overall streetscape and the city in general. We determine where they are applicable, and I will go over them one by one. We look at building orientation, massing, roof, wall articulation, the way that the openings are done, fenestry, colors, materials. Height is not in our architectural standards, but it's also something controlled by the city. We have a height limit of 35 feet overall and of 65 feet in the downtown village core. But we don't go more higher than 35 feet. We also look at service areas, and we give some space for alternative design techniques. So this is the main structure of what we have today. So again, the intent is to make the city more attractive, to increase the improve pedestrian orientation and pedestrian circulation mainly, and to develop in a way that will enhance the overall cityscape and the experience that the citizens have. We would like to discuss with you and have some input on two other goals. These are the new ones. One would be to ensure that development functions well within the city in terms of what are the goals of the whole land development code, which we are now discussing in terms of form-based code, enhancing the public space, and also to promote some type of sustainability and energy efficiency through architecture. This could be something that we could add to what we have today. Of course, that this will depend on the willingness of the various boards and the city council to put that as an option. We think that it could be an option, like through incentives or something like that. But we would like to discuss that with you. So today the applicability of the architectural standards is by zoning district. So it's applicable on commercial and office uses zonings, office and commercial uses in special exception use orders, office and commercial use in PUDs, and we will have also to change to include mixed-use zoning districts, which we are in the process of adding to our land development code because of our comp plan. We don't apply the architectural standards which were approved by City Council through Ordinance 1303 in 2005 on PUDs and development agreements that are dated before that date. So just to give you an example, we still have some PUDs. The development agreements are still in effect that have commercial parcels that have not been developed. These include Live Oak and Oviedo Forest. We have big commercial parcels that they are regulated by PUDs, by development agreements, that have not been, that officially would not be applied, could not be applied the architectural standards. But we are having actually a meeting with our city attorney on the 29th of May, on the 29th, to discuss how the city could deal with that in terms of making some type of application of the architectural standards in those particular PUDs. So just talking about building orientation, again, it's mainly to enhance the experience of the pedestrian and how you access the building. That is the main issue. Today, the building orientation, we have some limitations in terms of if the building can be, the main entrance can be in the front of, fronting a public street, or it can be also on the side of the public street. It doesn't need to be necessarily on the front. What we would like to add as a result of some discussions and controversies relating to this issue is that when the entrance, and that's what we are putting there as a new item, when the entrance is not facing a public street, that facade be considered to be considered to require more elements to make it better and more in, I'd say, consistent with its frontage to a street. So that's what we would like to see, what types of elements, if like transparency would be one, like windows, if these would be requirements or not, or what types of elements that would add to that specific facade when you have that situation. These are just some examples of street retail in terms of continuous buildings when you just have to deal with the facade of the building because the sides, they are, almost like internal walls. The other one is like an example of a standalone that has an entrance. Maybe you are not seeing very well, but the entrance is on the side. But at the same time, the whole building was treated as a corner. It has a lot of transparency. You also can look at the signage with the architecture. Today, we look at signage as a separate issue. Signage can have an architectural impact on a building. So if you just as an example, this building here has signage also on a blank wall, and it makes a difference in that blank wall. So it can be one element that we can consider as part of the architecture of a building. Today, this is not. We don't do that. We have regulations in terms of location, in terms of area of signage, in terms of types of signage, but it's not directly related to the architecture of the building. Well, massing is basically what's the volume of the building and the shape, and how we can reduce the impact of big buildings into small scale, more human scale approaches. That's, I'd say, one reaction to the so-called big boxes that are very common in a suburban landscape and that have an impact that's not considered to be very good. So you can see in various municipalities, in various types of codes, that massing is one element that it's used to downsize what could be a big, massive building. This is just an example of what could be done. You have to recess. You can use transparency. You can use overhangs. With the shape of the building, you can form a small urban plaza. You can see here it's like an L. So these are some elements that we can use, an architect can use when designing a building. Today, we use what we call massing for buildings that are, if the building, the footprint is up to 15,000 square feet, you don't have to do any massing. You don't have to. If it's from 15,000 to 2999, you have to have 2 building masses, 2 different volumes. If it's more than 30,000 square feet, 3 building masses. And that's an illustration on how you can attain that by setback or by offset. This is just one example of what it would be a setback on the second floor. And at the same time, you're using the corner as one element that it breaks the massiveness of a big building. Well, what happens is that since 2005, the majority of the buildings, the commercial buildings where we would have applied this requirement, it has never been applied because all our buildings were less than 15,000 square feet. So the question is, should we lower it for buildings that would be not exactly small, but let's say a medium size, or this should continue like that? So that's another discussion that we would like to have your input about that. This is just other examples of how you can work with massing. In this right-hand side, you have a building that's mostly horizontal, but it's broken by some elements, both in the material of the facade, as the same time as some offsets and some other types of elements in the roof. And the other one is also on the street level. You have a huge transparency through windows and glass. And on the upper floors, you work with other materials. You have some overhangs. So there are many things that can be done to a big building to appear and to enhance its overall volume. Another issue that we take into account is roof modulation. The roof modulation, there are three main aspects that we look today, which is the roof, picket roofs, the decorative parapets, and also we limit the way that a roof line can be horizontal for a certain distance. In small buildings, cannot be more than 40 feet. In bigger buildings, it can be 75 feet before you have some type of element that would break the horizontal line of the. Here are two, which we consider two good examples of roof modulations. The first one on the left, you have different types of facades, not only on the roof, with different sizes, recesses. You have parapets, and at the same time, you also have some type of pitched roofs. This one, you have actually a continuous line, but you have some elements here that go, these vertical elements, they go into the roof area, and they break the continuous line. So these, are what we consider good examples, but not always these these requirements work. These would be two types of buildings that could pass our architectural standards, but we don't consider that they are good solutions. The first one on the left, you can see that you have different sizes, different types of tiles on the same facade with different colors. You have a pitched roof, which is real. The other one, it's interrupted on the middle. You have a second, it looks like a second floor that it's not actually a second floor. You don't have windows. You just have some types of decorations there. Besides that, you have all that facade very far from the street, which is another issue. It's the site itself. So it's not, the building can be very pleasant, very well done, but in the middle of a parking lot, it will lose the impact that it would have if it were close to the street. So this other example is here in Seminole County, where we also think that the parapets were not the best enhancement to the building. So what we want to say with that is that what we have today, and it's very difficult to obtain good results, even if we have many guidelines, because a building is not just one or the other or another element. It's the whole thing that we have to consider. But when we are looking at requirements, we are giving the applicant some choices, and he can pick some of the choices. So it's a very difficult balance that we have to have in mind, that many times it cannot work. This is just one example of this is a museum in a small coastal town in Finland, which is being finalized in 2013. And it's what we consider a good example. This is just a model of a museum is a bigger structure. So what they did is they worked with, and it was located in a small town. You can see surrounding this building here, you can see that there are very many small structures with pitched roofs, and they used the volume and the multiple peaks in the whole design of the whole building to kind of minimize the impact that a big structure would have in that specific setting. So there are, again, this is a good example of a good approach and very good design of a building. Well, the other element that we look at is wall articulation. And I'd say that wall articulation is the one that it's most important in terms of the impact that it has on the street, because it's where you enter the building. Whereas both massing and roof, you can see from far away. It is when you get into the building that you experience that you enter there, that you are in front of it, is when you see how the walls and how the facades are looking like. So this is just what we have today in our code is to avoid blank walls. That's the main goal of the wall articulator. We have a repertoire of 7 things that you can do. And depending on the facades, which today we have primary facades and secondary facades. And the definition of primary facades are the ones that are front a public street and the ones that have main entrances. Secondary facades are usually the facades that you can see from a public street, not necessarily fronting it, but you can see it. So these are the 2 types of facades, each one of them. The primary facade requires 3 elements that the applicant can put in their buildings, and the secondary facades require just 2 elements of a list. So you can pick and choose just 2 or 3 of them to put in your building. Again, I mean, that's one way of dealing with it, but still we are not seeing the building as a whole. We are just looking at the facades when we live in a 3-dimensional world. So we have to take a look at the building as a whole and not just at the facades. These are just some examples of what more modern architecture is using in terms of color. You can see on color and material. On the bottom, there's a lot of use of transparency through glass compared to more massive materials. And the other one is I'd say that the main, you have vertical elements in glass, and also you have some overhangs on the top that give some type of airiness to the building. Or you can deal with blank walls, having a mural, which we don't have any type of regulation here. Actually, I don't know if this would be allowed or not. I don't think so. But, I mean, it is something that can be, thought about, depending on the occasion. The other elements that we use, we look at is fenestration. We have some requirements in terms of the windows have to be transparent, but we don't have a requirement saying that we have to have windows. And why is that? Because nowadays, with the advancement of technology, we can have a building completely enclosed because we can provide ventilation and light mechanically. So the way that, and we don't have in our building codes any type of requirement that says that you have to provide certain amount of natural light or of natural ventilation. So to a certain extent, the building codes may work against the architectural guidelines because we would like to enhance the facades, we would like to have transparency, and at the same time, they are not required by other codes. So it's a tension between what would be what the city would like and what is allowed by the building code. And you can see examples of various buildings here in the city too that are completely, the only opening that they have is the entrance door. So you don't see windows. Many times windows are fake windows, which I'd say that are questionable too in terms of how you enhance a facade. Colors is another issue that we limit. We don't have a color palette, which I think it's good that we don't have a color palette because you have to give some flexibility in terms of what the owners want to do. We have limits in terms of the 3 main colors and 1 trim color. On the other hand, this is exactly the same language that we have in our code. They cannot be bold, they cannot be fluorescent, pearlescent, or excessively reflective color. And they cannot be glaring or unattractive. So the 2 examples here probably would not be allowed in a video, like this bright yellow and the colorful detail here would not be allowed. On the other hand, that one, I believe it's a library. I don't remember. Do you know whether it's a library, that building there? Which the color is actually through when the building is lit at night. That's when you see it. Which is another way of enhancing architecture when you are designing it, is how you see it during the night and how you see it during the day and how you see it at night. Oops. There is just one last thing to talk about is materials. Also, we have some limitation of the use of metal panels. We just allow them to be used as accent or on the roof. Concrete blocks, they cannot be used exposed. They have to have some type of material, usually stucco. And glass blocks, they can only be used as accents too. We don't have any requirement of having certain types of materials. These are just 2 examples of one on the left is using brick as a main material. This is by a very famous architect, Alvar Aalto, is a Finnish architect. This is actually a city hall in a small town. On this other side here, it's an example of a commercial building just with stucco, and it's actually in Baldwin Park. So 2 different eras, 2 different materials. The use of materials too, it's something that in architecture in nowadays considered by the green movement as something important in terms of reflecting where the material comes from, how much energy you put on it, not just on building, but on transporting it. On the other side, another thing to be taken into account and how it insulates the building in terms of colors, because especially in Florida, we have a lot of sun. Lighter colors are more desirable from a standpoint of maintaining the temperature of the building, optimizing, I'd say, the temperature of the building. So there are many other discussions in terms of materials relative to colors, to where they come from, how they can be used, how much energy that they require. That could be also included in our architectural standards if we would like to have that discussion and see whether that would help and be something that would enhance our city and at the same time give some economic advances and advantages, actually. So I will finish my part here, and I'll pass it to Ms. Correa for finalizing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gino. So I'm going to talk about challenges and opportunities. One of the challenges, as Ms. Ferreira was talking about, is that is how to allow for innovative design if you have a predetermined, rules provided by the city. So this is the Bilbao Museum, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao in Spain, and these wouldn't pass our code. This is by Frank Gehry, a famous architect, considered an outstanding architecture, but it wouldn't comply with the city. We have in the city the opportunity to approve alternative design techniques and projects, but it has to pass the city council. So, of course, we don't foresee that we'll be reviewing a project like that so soon here, but anyway, we want to provide alternatives. When we were discussing with Brian Cobb about the presentation, he said, well, try to bring an example of a small city that has, more modern architecture, a more innovative design. So I looked at our sister city, Oviedo in Spain, which is a historic city, has a preserved historic site in downtown, but also allows for modern architecture and new examples of architecture. So every city should be open to new developments too. So this is one of the challenges that the architectural guidelines pose to the city and to us, the ones reviewing it. So these are, again, examples of great architecture that wouldn't pass our code review. The code itself, it's a challenge, how to write it in a way that is clear, that is consistent, and that is predictable and objective. And I will distribute to you an article that we have printed, and that discusses the challenges of regulating the architectural character of a city. And it stresses how clear and objective we have to be able to in providing those guidelines. So we cannot have language that says we want to provide for a more beautiful, environment or a more attractive environment. It doesn't mean anything because it means a lot of things to different people. What is attractive environment? So we have to be objective. We have to be able to quantify, and identify what are the measures that we are applying and what we want to achieve with those measures. So clarity, consistency, and predictability are a big, thing that we have to take into account. The other challenge, and as we can see from the presentation from Ms. Frue, is that good architecture doesn't come from good guidelines from the public sector. It comes from a good project. It comes from a good architect behind a good project. We can help in setting the basic rules. This is what we consider basic. But it's the challenge is that you can comply with the code and achieve a very poor architecture because we don't control the end result. But we do control the public space. So although we are, and this is a presentation on architectural guidelines, we want to stress that the city has the opportunity to improve the attractiveness of the city and the built environment and the public space by investing in the streetscape and as we discussed in the form-based code. So I'm going to give an example here of a very poor architecture, which is something that we can see, around, Central Florida, these small, big boxes. And by the way, as when Ms. Frey was talking about facades, one of the challenges of suburban environment is that because they all usually use a freestanding building in the middle of a lot, surrounded by parking lot, basically all the facades become primary facades because we can look at all of them. When you have a row of buildings that are attached to each other. You just see the primary facade. But when they are standalone, all of them are visible. So that's an additional element in the suburban area. So here you have the same architecture, but the outcome is completely different because you are investing in the landscape, in benches, in lighting, with a proper public space. So this is an area that we have much more control, and we can affect the end result in a much more effective way. We also have opportunities, and as we discussed last time, we have opportunities for large interventions, and one of the trends is retrofitting strip malls, because strip malls are boring, basically, and they are not very lively, and so there is this need to revamp them, and we have the opportunity to increase the density in these areas and provide for structured parking and using the existing footprint, but reshape the whole space. Instead of having big boxes like Walmart, we can have neighborhood Walmarts, and that's the trend that all cities are witnessing. And this is an example in Lee County here in Florida. The other great opportunity for us is to invest in our corridors. Again, that relates to our presentation on form-based code. And this is an example in Virginia, but this was promoted by the Department of Transportation. And it just points out in the suburban corridor what are the problems. You don't have proper sidewalks. It's not really an inviting place to walk. The emphasis is on through travel, so local traffic is not the priority. There is limited transit alternatives. There are no alternative routes because, again, if we are talking about the suburban environment, the neighborhoods are built with cul-de-sacs or with gated communities, so we don't have many options to go from point A to point B. So you have to, come through these corridors. You have a lot of surface parking. You don't have proper landscape. But again, we can change the whole environment by solving those issues, by providing for greater sidewalks, by allowing buildings or requiring buildings to be placed closer to the streets. Provide for landscape, make sure that the crosswalks are done in a way that that is comfortable for pedestrians. And by providing connectivity within the city, we are also providing alternative routes for people to go. So this is not the only way to go. And Mitchell Hammock for us is a big priority because from all the corridors, it's the street that we own. So it's a city street, so we would have more control over reshaping Mitchell Hammock. The other thing that we should consider is the relationship between planning and economic opportunity. So that's something that the city could also pay attention to. And for instance, we have the strip mall at the downtown, which is a typical suburban strip mall. But the interesting thing is that we have the creation now of a little hub of antique stores. There are being placed there. So that would be an opportunity to rethink about that strip mall and trying maybe to come up to this end result where you have a more lively environment. So the city could try to pursue a partnership with landowners and see how we can rethink that whole area with the end of the trail, because there is already an economic, initiative that is very interesting for the city, and this could be a destination place in the city. The other focus that for opportunities would be to create these small urban interventions. And these are two examples of Winter Park. And Winter Park is an interesting city because it's not a typical suburban city, although it's in Central Florida. And it has a lot of little squares, little places, where you have a little fountain and 3 benches. And you can see that people, really make use of that. And that it's what gives you the feeling of a city, right? You have places to go, you have public spaces to visit and stay. This is, on the left, is in Winter Park Village, and they created this, there are 2 of these games that kids can play and that sort of thing. But little fountains like the one on the right, you have, and I counted just along Park Avenue, you have 5 or 6. So you have a lot of these small places that we could also think of providing here in the city. Another opportunity is to create the facade improvement grant program, which many cities have in place, and which would be also a service that the city could provide by identifying small, commercial units that are still there. In the future, they will certainly be replaced, but they are still there. But they could improve, enhance the environment, but just having a different color or different elements, and the city could help, achieve this better environment. Again, another example of buildings that don't look very attractive, but they are, in principle, they have nice elements, and they are very close to the examples on the right. So just by changing the color or by bringing some elements, architectural elements, you could completely change the shape of those buildings and the public's perception on that area. Again, another example of places that we could intervene, and this is here in our Publix at Alexandria and Lafayette Trail, where you have that wall of services. This was approved much before our architectural guidelines were in place, but still, they are in a primary street, so we could have a plan for that. And interestingly, last week, the manager from, or I think someone representing the owner of Publix contacted us, and they wanted to discuss an expansion. So that would be a good opportunity to negotiate, improving that whole facade, which is really a rear facade, but it's facing our street here. So these are examples of how we could enhance and beautify, a blank wall or a service area. And just to finalize and open for discussion, architectural review is a complex process because it is basically, and the article discusses that, it is seen as an intrusion from the public sector in the private development. So there are limitations that we have to work with, and it's not a guaranteed process of success because we don't control the end result. But we can control the public space. So there is this balance here that we don't have much control on the architecture itself, but we have much more control over the streetscape and the public area. If we want to approach that, if we want to have that approach in the city, we will have to create a structure in the city to be able to propose different, have a more urban design-oriented structure in the city. So that's something that we wanted to raise too. Today we are also distributing to you a visual preference survey, and I'll just stop a minute if Patty could distribute. And we are using you and our city council members as a pilot audience for this visual preference survey because we want to distribute that to the public too. You have here 24 questions. They are divided into categories, and each category has 6 pictures, and we are asking you to grade them. And you have a grade system from -3 to 3. -3 meaning the least desirable or liked a picture or environment, and 3 the most desirable, 0 being neutral. You don't need to rank them, so you may like all of them, dislike all of them. And in the end, if you would like to also provide comments, and that would be great because we are welcoming any kind of input, and that would help us not only in the land development code rewrite, but also, I mean, what are the things that we need to incorporate, not only about the standards, but new ideas or new issues that you would like us to discuss. So that's something that we are distributing today. Feel free to return to us whenever you want. You don't need to do it right now. We want you to have time to do that. And the next week we are also going to distribute to City Council members. And the next step, the next work session, we'll be discussing standards, and one of them, which is a major one, will be parking. And we also probably are going to discuss also signs with you, and probably townhomes, right, that we discussed. And I believe we may have an additional one that we discussed with Mr. Carb about the approval process. We are not yet quite sure about that one. But standards for sure we'll be discussing next time. And the directions. What are the things that we need to have from you or would like to discuss today? The emphasis on siting. I mean, we are proposing to create, to try to understand architecture in relation to its context. When we talk about, for instance, orientation, and that buildings should be oriented to the primary facade, to the public street, that is great. But if the building is set back 50 feet away from the street, it doesn't make any difference. Where is, the primary entrance oriented to, because we don't have a perception of that building anyway. So we would like to incorporate that in our architectural guidelines. The other thing is about styles, if you want to see diversity or not. We are proposing a diverse, environment, so not really stick on one style, but we would like to hear your opinion. The same thing with materials and colors. As Mrs. Fried emphasized, we are proposing to have a more open set of rules as to materials and colors, but we would like to hear from you. Increased height, that is something that was discussed in the one-on-one meeting with City Council members, that some of them would like to see the city getting more vertical, so increasing the height of the city. So we are also, we would like to discuss that. And as Ms. Fried mentioned, the signage. We would like also to see signage incorporated because it is one of the elements of the architecture. And with that, we are open for discussion. And
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Well, I want to thank you for including so many pictures. After having sat on several of the committees about the new downtown and the park and all those, the pictures, I think, help as much as anything. You can have all these wordy descriptions about stuff, but when you actually see it, and particularly contrasting one that doesn't look so good to one that does, it helps me anyway be able to actually visualize it then. So I appreciate you putting all the pictures in. Mr. Ray?
I guess one of the themes I saw, though, was there is, and you mentioned it, there's a lot of chance for interpretation, especially in some of the examples that you showed where we had buildings that would meet our current standards, but that's not necessarily desirable in what we would like to see. And I guess the question I would have is, that seems like a big gap to try to cover as far as closing in on something that would limit that to, the preferred methods and stuff like that. And I guess what I'm thinking is, how do you propose to cover that? How do you cover that gap? How do you close that so that we can, take out the fact that we're making an interpretation and forcing it on someone else's development? Makes sense? I mean, that's a long road right there that I think you got to hoe.
That's the challenge, yeah, because we don't control, right? So we can codify what we. I think that the architectural guidelines has an important message to developers, in that it says that the city of Oviedo values, the aesthetics of the buildings. So that's a good message to convey, that we are worried about that. We want to improve it, but we will never be sure to have, no gap, because it is ultimately, it's the developer, wish. If I think that looks beautiful and I'm, complying with the code, we don't have any ground to ask anything else. So that's unless there is a different process, right?
I like the
as to the
idea
approval
of the graphic. I think that was one of the topics that you covered in there, is about providing more graphical information in the codes, in a sense.
so that we convey the message clearer.
Yes, and one of the ways I was thinking is that, as simple as like this. I mean, we can go through this and pick out what we kind of like individually. Is that if you, the city, in a sense, put together, and I think you used the word palette, just like we would at a homeowners, where we have a certain range of ideas or concepts that we really like, and you could present it in that format. The only thing I would say is that there may have to be some type of incentive. This is what we would prefer. This is what we like. This is what we see as value, as you said, value. But there may just have to be some type of incentive to the developer to do that, because it's going to be a cost. There's going to be a cost to doing stuff like that, without codifying, saying this is the only way we're going to allow you to put your development in. But
Before, I'm just going to say two things that we are trying to achieve in better communication. One is that we are requesting now a board from developers, that they bring not only the facade in color, but also the materials, a sample of the materials. So only requesting that shows, sends them the message that, we are worried about it. So that's a good, a way to communicate. And I have something else that I was going to say. And also, we would like to also put in our pre-app room pictures of things that we would like to see in the city, because it also helps when we are discussing, in the pre-application meetings. I mean, this is what we think it's a good architecture, or these are things that city council members, PZA, consider a good, will be welcoming, an initiative like that. So I think this would help, but.
Just something in relation to what you said in terms of what would comply, and actually it doesn't work. I think that one issue that we have to face is that we are in the types of sites that we have in commercial and office buildings, like I said before, they are standalone buildings. When you have a standalone building, and especially when it's surrounded by parking. You have a lot of space. You have a lot of visual perspectives to see all the sides of the building from wherever you are. So what happens is that when we deal with facades only, we are decomposing what is a three-dimensional building and vision into planes. And that's what I call the scenario architecture. On a scenario, you just see one plane. You just see the front, right? But you don't see what's behind it. The problem is that when you are approaching any building here, because of the distance that you have when you're coming by car or even by walking, you see all the three facades, almost all the time, all the three facades. So this, I think that having primary, secondary, and rear facades when we don't require anything, I'm not sure if this is the best way to approach, as instead we should approach as the envelope of the building. One good example is we require one of the items. Yeah, if it's a standalone. When we require, for primary facades, we have a list of things that you can do, and they can pick any three of them. We don't have control on what they are picking. The applicants, sometimes the rear, one of them would be the parapet to hide the mechanical equipment. But on a rear facade, we don't have any requirement. What happens is that the parapet stops on a corner, and you can see it, but it's complying. So that's what I talked about in the beginning of my presentation, is that you cannot decompose the building into some elements. We have to look at it as a whole, especially if you are a standalone building with a lot of perspective to be seen. Well, what's the downside of that? It's more expensive. Of course it is. For who is building, to put a parapet around everything, to put some types of architectural elements that will enhance the buildings. We know that. So that's why it's complicated, because, well, we are in an economy that now it's recovering from a recession, and everybody has their reasons. So it is complex. It doesn't mean that we will have guarantee that we will have a good architecture, because a good architecture comes from good design. Period.
Are you? Do you envision that you'd have to have a architectural review board that would have to have some type of, whether it's volunteer board like us, or is it going to be internal, public employees that make that determination?
No, that's something that we'll have to
Or do we
discuss.
become the board?
We'll have to discuss. Well, there are, and it's interesting because an architectural review board would have the opportunity to review the whole, project, but also it would add one more step into the process. So it goes both ways. It's more expensive. It's because it's lengthier. It may be more subjective, right? So, it works both ways, and it's something that I think the city will have to decide at a certain point. And I think when we review the approval process, we'll have the opportunity to. But you're right. That would be one of the routes to go.
A couple more questions, I'll be quiet. Are you looking at having, what's your timeline? Is this like trying to do this for the next for trying to get this resolved by the next review of the land development code at this point? Is that,
Yes, that's
sometime
part, yeah.
October, September, next year, or this year and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's, so far, right now we are in the next year, May, March, yeah.
So it's, that's, I guess, what I was asking, is it 2014, 2013, that means, so 2013, is just around the corner, obviously, with where you'd be at. Seems like for what you wanted, that hill you want to climb to get to that point, to get that blocked in, seems kind of short. So I guess the last question is, are you looking to do any public charrettes or anything like that? So bringing in people to gain input, kind of, I mean, basically you're getting our input like this, but typically in something like this, you usually get the public's, open public meeting to do a survey or presentation of the same nature in a sense.
We are planning to put the visual preference survey online, so that we reach citizens, and also we are going to do internally to the employees of the City of Avila, so we'll reach the public. City Council hasn't decided about the charrette, and actually, so far I've heard only negatives, right, to charrettes, but we'll do
Yeah,
whatever.
the advantage. I attended one for Winter Spring several years back, that they invited the public, and it was basically very similar, to determine that value or view of what they wanted their city to look like, and the do's and don'ts, and, it accepted public input as far as what their priorities were in a sense like that. So, a lot of way. I mean, again, it was good. It was well received and stuff. But, because again, the key is this is, and again, the key word you said is subjective. This is subjective and very interpretive on, every member of this board would have a different interpretation as to, what they preferred, and you'll see that obviously in our stuff. But it's a difficult thing to lock down. We can't even lock down signs, after 15 years.
Yeah,
So,
and please.
Now you're talking about knocking down full architectural standards.
Yeah. And please be sincere in the survey, because what we are trying to achieve is really trying to find the common ground, right? And so that's the opportunity for everyone to express their own,
No, I'm a proponent. I mean, I'm not. I like where the direction it's going, but I just realize how difficult that is, And again, I look at the opportunities that the city has at this point. I mean, we have, and my personal, we've been, as you know, we've been looking for a place in the city. So please do this after we buy out our building. No, kidding. There are areas that we have that are available for redevelopment, especially the strip malls. There's a couple that, we know that are sitting there that would be vacant, and great opportunities to do that kind of stuff at. We have a lot of buildings that, are still going into this day that necessarily would be on the do not do list, that are being built perpendicular to the road with no windows, or, like I said, no facades, and there are boxes and stuff like that. So, that at some point you have to start this process. I'm just thinking that we're probably 10 years past where we should have been, to really get this look that we're looking for at this point. So, now it's more about the redevelopment of the area, not necessarily, new stuff that's going in. That's probably your more better shot at it. So, thank you.
Okay.
I've got a question about the speed. I know that's odd, but most of the areas that I'm familiar with that resemble some of the things that we're going for are very small residential areas, or have, tight roads with slower traffic. And I know the rendering you were showing was a 6-lane highway, and I'm thinking of Mitchell Hammock. Are there guidelines about when you start having the setbacks so close to the roadway with frontage so close on these large thoroughfares that we're talking about? Because we're looking at Mitchell Hammock, which to me is this fast corridor, and I'm wondering, as you start bringing facades in, how tight do you get? I'm just thinking more from a safety and a speed issue. What are the guidelines versus a Baldwin Park, where it's a slower cobblestone-y kind of feel, and same with Winter Park, those are very slow, stop sign-based environments.
You hit exactly what we have been discussing, that we have to relate, the setbacks to the speed of the road, and also as to the buffer, how far, for instance, because if you have a large sidewalk, with a nice buffer with landscape, then that's less of a problem, right? But if you don't have room for a wide sidewalk for proper buffer, then you have to compensate that with your buffer. So the zero setback that we discussed in the form-based code, it's not going to be applied everywhere. So it has to be in the relationship with the speed of the road.
Are there any other
Can I
questions?
follow up on that real quick? because of our way our city is centered on two state and county roads, we have very limited control over our, 434 corridor or 426 corridor or 419 corridor. Mitchell Hammock is really our only east-west major thoroughfare that we can control, and for the most part, it's residential on one side and non-sod on the other side. So with 419 being widened from Oviedo down to Lockwood, how much say do we have at this point in the design that it's already been approved and you're going through, that we could implement some of the stuff that you're looking at? Ms. Hughes had mentioned about, controlling distances and speeds and stuff like that. I mean, right now, it's a 35-mile-an-hour zone for the most part, 2-lane with a, fairly rural setting in a sense, but it's about to go to 4 lanes or 5 lanes with probably an urban section at some point, which some of the stuff they did at 434 and Mitchell Hammock, where they did the architectural improvements, the stamping, concrete stamping, and all that kind of stuff, obviously enhances that kind of stuff. But do we have we got stuff in place already for that, or are we already falling behind the curve on that?
Well, I believe that the best people to answer that would be some staff from Public Works, because they deal directly with the county and the state. What we can say is that there is a trend now in FDOT to value or to give more importance to the safety and to the pedestrian. So now is what we call complete streets policy. So the fact that we are going to widen 419, one of the things that we have already discussed is that, well, that's okay that you have 4 lanes, but you have to have islands in these lanes for people to be able to cross. Another thing is the width, like we were talking about, of the sidewalks. I mean, it's crucial that you protect, people that are walking along those streets that are 45 miles an hour. Like, actually, the 426 is 35 in most of until the Kingsbridge East.
Right.
For Mitchell Hammock is all 45. So we have to think about that on how to solve that. I myself, I live in Kingsbridge East, and I walk sometimes here. And it's very interesting because there are some segments of Mitchell Hammock that the sidewalk is 5 feet, and you have 2 feet from the pavement. So you have all these 50-mile-an-hour cars passing by you here. On other parts of Mitchell Hammock, there is something that was very well done, especially in front of Lake Rogers. There is a huge difference, a huge distance between the pavement and the sidewalks with vegetation. So this not only gives you the feeling of safety, and it reduces considerably the noise. It's incredibly different, the feeling. Yeah. Plus, it has shade. You have a lot of... So there is a way to deal with that. I know that along Mitchell Hammock, along Lake Rogers, I was looking at the plats. Actually, it's an easement. It's not city street, but probably it's maintained by the city. On the other side of the road where Kingsbridge West is, you also have some type of vegetation between the sidewalk and the pavement that gives you some type of protection. That side of the street, it belongs to the city. So it will very much depend on how the city negotiates with the developer, the way that they plat the roads, and how much that we have in place in terms of urban design guidelines on how to deal with different types of streets, especially having the pedestrian as one very important part of the equation, which has not been until very recently. So I believe that that can be dealt with, but we have to have our guidelines, which we don't have today.
Thank you.
Mr. Lopez, do you have anything?
Oh, I don't have a problem with it because I think, I think our biggest issue is going to be educating, our residents and developers to understand the new concept. I think, obviously it's been working in Europe, and it's worked in a few major cities in the United States. So it's just an education, I think. You hit it on the head, we're about 10 years behind the 8 ball with that. But I think some of these big boxes, that you had some of the examples, I mean, those would be prime candidates that they should build up instead of just out, and it would recuperate their costs. So even though cost is more expensive, they go up, it reduces their cost. But I think it's just a matter of educating, the residents, the consumers, and the developers. I think it's a win-win for the city. And it's just a matter of educating everybody, and I think we need to do that. The city needs to do that quickly. And I have been to Oviedo, Spain.
Oviedo, yeah. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Very. Well, it's a college town just like that. It's got one of the oldest universities in Europe, and it's you would never know. You've got modern mixed with, buildings that are at least 500-600 years old. So it works.
Anything else?
No.
Mr. Sheridan, you've been awfully quiet.
And will continue to be so.
Okay.
Well, there is one thing. I asked
Mr.
for copies
Lopez?
of last month's presentation.
I'm sorry?
I asked last time we had the presentation, the first presentation. I asked for copies. We
Didn't
never
you?
got them.
Remember?
Can we get these as well, perhaps?
I'll get both presentations for everybody, so you'll have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted to remind, Deborah just remind me to say that we are now getting input from you when we are already in the review process, but we'll come back with the standards itself for you to review. I mean, this is not, it doesn't end here. When we have the language, written for the standards, we'll have to come back and you have to review that.
Okay. Ms. Hughes, did you have anything else? Okay. Seeing none, do you have anything else for us tonight?
Just about the visual survey, preference survey, if you want to give that back to us in our next meeting, that's fine too.
Could I suggest that whether you put a note on our agenda or when Patty sends it out to remind everyone,
To bring
Okay.
the survey.
Yes.
Okay.
even if we had a discussion item to turn them in, something so that,
We don't forget.
yes,
And if you have additional comments,
We don't forget anything.
just put that in.
not us.
Not anymore.
Nothing of importance, anyway.
That was good. Okay. Is there anything else? Seeing none, we stand adjourned.